like to welcome everyone back from the coffee break. One does usually not need coffee before getting to hear from Karen Greenberg, a noted expert on national security, terrorism, and civil liberties. Karen is the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham Law School, a great friend to all of us. She has authored and edited several books, The Least Worst Place about Guantanamo Prison, and her latest book is titled, I should mention that is her favorite book, I believe, and her latest book, which is titled Rogue Justice, The Making of the Security State, and explores the war on terror's impact on justice and law in America. It is a pleasure to welcome Karen and the members of her panel.
The methods and the policies and the law behind what law enforcement does in the name of counterterrorism, and the tension that exists between that and what I read in my program was social cohesion. And the thing I want to say about that is we're going to talk a lot historically and chronologically in this panel about the evolution of the threat and the evolution of counterterrorism policy and how it's come to rest in the foreign fighter domain. But first I want to just take a note and say that forgetting all the other counter threat, the narrative has changed a little bit in terms of how we see ourselves. Because if we were doing this 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we would be talking about the conflict between the rule of law and the counterterrorism policies. It would be that would be the realm we were in. Some people would call it liberty and security. There are a lot of ways to say it, but I would have said the rule of law and the policies developed for counterterrorism writ large. And now we've added this notion of, what if we do it the wrong way? What can happen? What can be, or can we get caught in a loop that we can't get out of, which is trying to make things better and sometimes making them better and sometimes making them worse. So I think I just want to acknowledge that just in terms of how we think about it, our self-reflection on it, we have somewhat moved on, and I'll come back to that at the end. So we have a wonderful panel here for you, and I'm just going to introduce them. We're going to do this a little differently than the other panels, or at least we're going to try. We're going to have a conversation because the individuals on this panel that represent the EU, the UK, and the United States in terms of how the counterterrorism policy has evolved, they don't agree on everything. And so I thought it might be a good idea to sort of bring out their differences and their similarities in conversational style. So I'm just going to begin to my left, Paul Haertel, who we were really pleased to have. Never had you on a panel before. I'm hoping to have you on many more. Is currently the Deputy Assistant Director in the FBI's Counterterrorism Division, where he oversees global FBI investigations and operations. And one of the things I want to get into today is the role of the FBI outside of the United States, and not just about the United States, in the larger global terrorism conversation. Prior to coming to the Counterterrorism Division, Paul led the counter-espionage section of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. And his knowledge of the terrorist threat goes way back to before 9/11, and so that's going to become an important part of our conversation, the longer historical past. Joshua Geltzer is the founding executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection. It's a long title. And visiting professor of law at Georgetown Law. Before that, he was senior director for counterterrorism at the NSC, the National Security Council. And before that, he was deputy legal advisor to the National Security Council and counsel to the assistant attorney general for national security at DOJ. You look awfully young for that, I'm just going to say. To his left is Magnus Ranstorp. Magnus Ranstorp has been writing and thinking about counterterrorism for a long time, and has been kind of a guiding light to many of us who just have to know where to weigh in on what both the general conversation is and his particular take. And so thank you for that, and we're looking forward to this. Currently he is research director at the Center for Asymmetric Threat Studies at the Swedish Defense University. He's worked extensively on foreign terrorist fighters as well as on terrorism generally, and there's much more, but I'm gonna wait. And then finally, we have Ian Acheson. And Ian has an interesting past for this conversation and where I think we're going to take it. And that is that he's had a long career in public service in the UK, but he's known for two things. One of them is his work on counterterrorism policy and leading an international initiative for the British government on countering extremism. But even more than that, it was on countering extremism in the prisons. And so one of the things we're going to talk today about is prisons and Ian's take on what can be done in a constructive way about the use of prisons, and we'll get into more of that. So we have a lot to talk about, gentlemen, or rather, you have a lot to talk about. So I'm going to begin with one question, just to establish a baseline, which is starting whenever you want. Could be 9/11, could be the embassy bombings, Paul. It could be whenever you'd like. How do you see the evolution of the terrorist threat to today? Where do we stand today in terms of the general shape and the arc of things? And where does the foreign fighter fit into that? And if I interrupt you, it'll be because I don't understand something. So, Paul, we're going to start with you.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
So, again, thank you for everyone who set this up. This has really been a very good experience for me personally. In terms of the evolution of terrorism, I know that what I will say is not going to be a shock to anyone. But really prior to about 2014, what you had were groups who maintained the ideology. They maintained the firm grip on the planning, on the attacking. Planning for the attacks. And really what changed, in my opinion, was social media. Whereas before you had a longer period of time where you had to recruit, you had to train, you had to plan, you had to get the materials, you had to get people in the right positions to carry out the attacks. With social media, we now talk about the speed of radicalization being the speed of social media. And unfortunately, in the United States, we're seeing that the time from someone deciding to mobilize to the time of the attack has significantly decreased. So that gives us much less of a window to try and mitigate the threat.
Magnus, let's turn to you, and we'll get more into the United States versus the UK, but just generally from how you see it from the point of view of knowing so much about Europe in general. How do you see it?
Well, I think, well, first of all, thank you also to the organizers. I want to say that because I know what a tremendous effort it is to pull together such a gathering. I think, in general, from a European standpoint, the fact that we've had 5,000 plus male FDFs going down really illustrates the nature of the challenge. It is also nested within some other issues that we have to deal with within our society, dealing with increasing segregation, not meeting and discussing in a multicultural setting. We're seeing increasing polarization, the rise also of the far right, the alt-right, the neo-Nazis are also taking space, and they're also transnational. So I think we have sort of what I would say reciprocal radicalization and polarization. I know we're here to talk about the sort of foreign terrorist fighters, but I see an increasing complex environment, and I see also governments trying to struggle with how do we deal with this issue, not just in terms of the justice system, in terms of prosecuting them, putting away individuals for a long time. In Europe, we have different sentencing structures between different countries, and there we are in sort of a hamster wheel, in that we have hundreds of people being prosecuted, and then they're out again, unless they've committed, a lifetime offense. Then you also have the prevention side, which, and I don't want to get into, I know you have many questions like that, but many countries are also struggling with having an adequate prevention, holistic strategy. So how do you balance this repression, law enforcement, intelligence dimension with prevention?
Joshua, I want to talk about the United States and just bring it in a little bit. We can come back to Paul about this later. But for the United States, the foreign fighter crime and indictments peaked in 2015. It was really 1 year, 2014, maybe 18 months, 2015. Now you see very few terrorism indictments, and you see even fewer foreign fighter indictments, maybe 2 or 3. And one of the things that you had mentioned was, what is the concept of foreign fighters, which I think in the United States may be very different than it is in terms of what Magnus is talking about. It's a completely different environment. Can you address that in terms of the general, trajectory of what is happening in terms of the threat?
Sure, and let me add my thanks to the organizers, to Ali and others for putting together such a remarkable couple of days here. I'm privileged to be a part of this. I do think, as you say, Karen, that there was a peak in concern in the United States about foreign fighter flow, at least the outward flow, in the time period that you're talking about. And frankly, I think it's due to the good work of Paul and his colleagues, and due to the good work of others in law enforcement, that prioritize the idea of stopping those who might be drawn from the United States to Iraq and Syria. That was the focus then, though of course there have been other foreign fighter flows to other destinations like Afghanistan and Somalia over the years. But there was a priority placed on stopping people before they even went. And I think that was partly because that's the earliest point at which one can cut off the problem. The material support laws in the United States are robust enough that there is a crime by that point. And there's a sense that it's far easier than dealing with the intel challenges, and Nick spoke to some of these yesterday, of tracking people once they've gone. So in a sense, there is a very small, still concerning, but very small population that actually left the United States, went to Iraq, Syria, and may come back or go elsewhere. But there's also, and this goes to Paul's points about the social media landscape, what it means to go and return is not what it once did. Once, if you go back a couple decades to the earlier foreign fighter flows, one had to really join a group, it seemed, to fully embrace, radicalize, and then be prepared to come back and launch attacks. And of course, that's not what we see anymore. Now one can be drawn to, can radicalize without ever traversing the physical, the geographic landscape of going and then being a returning foreign fighter. And the flip side of that is one can return without actually leaving the group behind. One can remain in dialogue with, exposed to the continuing evolution of a group, even when one comes back. And I think all of that complicates what it means to be a foreign fighter. Right,
and I think the technology panel later today is really going to I hope, if not we can ask the question, is going to grapple with that. Ian, weigh in here. Where are we in terms of the threat of foreign fighters today from your point of view?
Okay. Thank you. And thank you again to Ali for putting on this superb conference. The hospitality has been as good as the networking, so we're very grateful to have you as an audience. I fear in the United Kingdom the threat hasn't peaked yet, sadly. But the threat has evolved, and as too has the capability of the security services to detect offences further and further upstream of actual attacks. So we've got two things going on. In the United Kingdom, the terrorism threat is severe, and that's the official threat level, which means that an attack is highly likely on UK soil. We've also got increasing expertise by the security services in detecting these crimes, as I've said, and we've got more judicial activism in more laws being brought in to criminalise behaviour that is linked to terrorism. So we've got a growing number of people who've been convicted in the United Kingdom and sent to prison. Coupled with that, we've got approximately 850 UK residents who went to fight in Syria, and we're told by our counterterrorism police that about 300 of them are estimated still to be overseas. And 2/3 of those people, by the way, have been deprived of their citizenship, and that's an administrative decision that's been made by our Home Secretary. And those are people who are dual nationals, for example, or who have another nationality but resided in Britain prior to going abroad. So we've got roughly about 100 people. I mean, the statistics are very hard to come by, obviously, because it's such a chaotic situation. But those 100 people will be returning to the United Kingdom. And there are three categories. There are the devout people, there are the disengaged people, and there are people who, for pragmatic reasons, have escaped the IS orbit. And we have to deal with those people coming back. Can I say one more thing at the start? I'm cross about something. And that is that the distinction that's been made between, I think it's incarceration versus rehabilitation in the premise of this panel, that's a false distinction.
Yeah,
I'm a prison professional. I want to talk about that later.
Definitely, I'm with you. We're going to talk about that. But I want to bring Magnus in here because it is true. The UK has produced an incredible amount of laws, particularly in recent times, way beyond what the United States has done for the Patriot Act, the Freedom Act, and a variety of different statutes that we've used. And yet, and I guess I'm going to ask you, and then I'm going to come back to you, Ian. What's happening? Why is it need for more and more and more ways of prosecuting, indicting, criminalizing this behavior? And yet, does it seem to be having an impact or not? And let's start with Magnus.
Oh, thank you for a difficult question. I think it really differs in different countries. You see some countries have an overemphasis on law enforcement and intelligence. In other words, they bring people in, they interrogate them, they probably need to, but sometimes, for example, in France, you have many people, we were told yesterday, 450 coming out from prison. Prison has become an incubator of radicalization. Same thing in some other countries. And actually how you run prison, we can talk about that, how you run prison is actually incredibly important. What intelligence do you have inside prison to know what is going on? How many do you hold together? Do you disperse them? Do you hold them together? There's a blended approach across Europe. But we have this dilemma in that we have to apply the rule of law. Many countries were also late waking up to this issue. We do it unevenly across the EU. For example, in France, you prosecute everyone. Men and women, and the children are taken off and into care. Even in the Nordic space where I come from, we've had 650 foreign fighters. In some countries, like Norway, you would prosecute them even in absentia. And in other countries, they will just meet the security service for a preventative dialogue. There will be no judicial measure at all, because the laws have been very slow to be implemented.
Paul, one of the things that comes up, you mentioned sentencing, the different ways that terrorism is treated in the different European countries. In the United States, there's no coherent, from one district to another in terms of the courts, there's no coherent sense of why somebody should be sentenced, how long they get sentenced for, how material support statutes are criminalized. And is there any talk about this, any sense of this inside of law enforcement, or any? I know we have the Department of Justice that was ostensibly organizes and administers some kind of best practices, but there is an awful gap, when judges are writing opinions about how long somebody gets sentenced for, and whether or not we should standardize it. Any sense of frustration about that, or any attention to that inside law enforcement that you've heard?
I think that would be a question better
I was
posed to
get
my
to
neighbor here. But the difference that I would make would not be necessarily in the federal system. It wouldn't be, Southern District of New York versus the District of DC. But when the crime doesn't meet the federal statutes, then you're dealing with state and local issues. And there you'll see a greater variance. From a law enforcement officer's perspective, there's always frustration with the attorneys and with the courts. But that's not uncommon, whether it's a drug case or a terrorism case, it doesn't matter. The one thing that we do see is, and that I think would be helpful for the law enforcement, would be sort of a standard. If you say if they have blood on their hands, blood in the streets, then does that mean we're actually going to bring someone back to the U.S. to prosecute? And that tends to vary with who's in the White House. So that would be the one thing that I would say.
Before we get to Joshua kind of giving us the context on that, can you talk a little bit about the FBI's outreach and their involvement with the United Kingdom and with the EU in terms of working on cases that might not necessarily come to the United States? And has the FBI's involvement gotten more, less? Has it stayed the same? How has that worked over time?
Since I've been in, which was in the 90s, the FBI has become much better at working with partners, whether that's within the US or outside. For example, in Dar es Salaam, we relied heavily on the Tanzanian authorities, and I know when in Nairobi they worked with the Kenyan authorities as well. The one thing that the FBI does very well is work with foreign partners. We're in roughly 92 different countries in the embassies, and the mandate of what we call our legats is to work specifically with that foreign country's authorities to enhance their capabilities, to enhance our capabilities. We learn from foreign partners as much as we give to foreign partners. We've started a program where we're sharing biometric data with different countries. The other thing that we're doing now is we're trying to take the battlefield intelligence, battlefield evidence, and put it into a form that can be used in court. And so we're very involved overseas, and what we're finding is perhaps we can't bring someone to the United States for prosecution, but we can help the Iraqi government, for example, prosecute someone for a homicide. And so we've been working with governments with law enforcement officials to enhance their cases and work with their different entities to enhance their ability to prosecute cases within their countries.
I remember that program that was set up at the Department of Justice to sort of help train, educate, particularly in Eastern Europe, but probably elsewhere, other legal systems to deal with terrorism and sort of practices that we've learned. But just in terms of getting back to this, how do you see this issue, both of sharing information, but of the larger context of what's happening inside? Do we have enough laws? Do we need, I mean, the UK is constantly, right? It's just, yeah. As a way of saying, here's what we need, here's what we're learning, here's what we need. What about in the United States? What's happening?
So I think, at least when it comes to terrorism that's linked to foreign terrorist organizations, there is a lot of law there. And, sentencing may not look the same everywhere, but that's partly by design. Partly sentencing is supposed to be individualized. It's supposed to look, and a judge is truly supposed to look in the eyes of an individual defendant and try to make an assessment of whether that person seems to be remorseful, has the potential to be rehabilitated. It's a very hard judgment to make. District judges will tell you that is not just the hardest, but sometimes the most agonizing part of a very hard job overall. And the material support statute does provide a baseline, but ultimately it's supposed to be something of individualized determination, and they get tough calls in front of them. I'm thinking now of a would-be traveler, I believe from Mississippi, who told his judge, the FBI saved my life. If the FBI hadn't intervened, I would now be in, I think, Syria, if not Iraq, and I'd probably be dead. What do you do with a case like that? Is that person being genuine? The judge needs to first ask that question. If the person is being genuine, that doesn't seem like somebody still entranced by whatever it was that was luring that person down the road of radicalization and criminal activity, because by that point it is criminal activity. That seems like a very different form of material support, a very different person from somebody who has killed people and is totally unremorseful about it. And so, yes, you don't want decisions to be or even seem arbitrary when it's about taking away people's liberty, but you also do want to give judges some flexibility to look people in the eye and assess them and figure out what's appropriate and what their future could look like depending on how the judicial system handles them.
I mean, when you think about terrorism, including the foreign fighters, as we've looked at them yesterday, we see basically several stages. So one is the pre-radicalization stage, which some people have focused on, in which you'd like to intervene early and make sure that doesn't happen. Then you see the kind of radicalized individual who may or may not commit an act and gets apprehended by law enforcement. Then you have the prison period. And then the question of rehabilitation and integration is something that has been mentioned many times, but we haven't really followed up on. Ian, do you want to talk a little bit about how you see the prison time, what efforts that have been done in the UK, and anything you want to talk about outside the UK, and the distinction you were talking about before, and sort of get into that a little bit?
Sure, that's a big topic. In terms of reintegration of terrorist offenders in the United Kingdom, the state has a monopoly on that at the moment. And there's also another factor, and that is the general state of disorder in our prisons in the UK. In the United Kingdom, we're addicted to cheap custody, and that's left overcrowded prisons in squalid conditions, denuded of staff. Now, if you're having a criminal justice system that is going to somehow accommodate returning foreign fighters, and we've described the scale of this, who are going to be put through a criminal justice process, about the worst thing that you can do is put them into a destabilised environment in close proximity to lots of alienated young men who are often highly violent and have an existential crisis themselves. So one of the problems that I tackle in my independent review of Islamist extremism in UK prisons was the concept of separation centres. And I think that concept can be applied as well to foreign fighters.
Explain.
Sure. So on the basis of the evidence that we looked at, including secret intelligence that isn't generally available and a survey of prison staff, we concluded that the threat that was posed by a small number of highly subversive, proselytizing, highly charismatic Islamist offenders was such that they needed to be completely incapacitated from being able to spread their hateful messages. So the concept of separation centres came up for those people. Now, what was really important about separating those people is that if it stops there, and you simply exclude these people and put them into punitive conditions, in my view, it's almost worse than doing nothing. So the part two to separation was to provide at least the opportunity for these people to tackle their offending behaviour, to tackle their toxic ideas, and to be able to at least have the prospect of change. Because just going back to what we were talking about, there's judicial activism and so on, one recanting terrorist, particularly if they've come back from the theatre in Syria, is worth 1,000 police officers. So we have to be focused on trying to at least permit people to be able to change through that process. Now, I would apply that same process to foreign fighters who are returning to the United Kingdom. At the moment, we've got a bit of a problem because I think there's a lot of anxiety in the British government about having people come back and be put through a criminal justice process, which is high standards, obviously, beyond a reasonable doubt for conviction, and having them being put through a process and evidence not sufficiently being available from the battlefield to be able to convict them, and those people somehow sort of slipping through the cracks. My view quite clearly is, in the interests of justice, and to demonstrate, continue to demonstrate, because this is very important, we talk about lots of systematic and security reactions against terrorism. Rule of law is one of the most fundamental ones. It is important for those people to go back and be put through a system. And what I've advocated for are centres where these people can have expert guidance, can have services built around them, to see if their offending behaviour can be changed, to try to change attitudes, and crucially, to prepare them for re-entry into society. In the UK, I'm sorry to labour the point, in the UK, the state is the monopoly over the reintegration of terrorist offenders. The state is not very good at doing that if you want long-term disengagement from hateful ideologies. We must have a partnership of the state and the communities these people have come from to bring them into the space where we're all working together to deal with a national security threat. We don't do that at the minute, and it's a fundamentally missing piece of the jigsaw in my view.
Paul, I know that the FBI and law enforcement generally has given a lot of thought to, the prison, what's going to happen in prison, how much we can, these prison sentences are about to be over in the United States for many of the individuals who were incarcerated right after 9/11 and got 20-year sentences and good time off, 18 years, whatever. So there's been a lot of talk about that. And a lot of these people are under supervised release for a long time. Do you get the sense, and I know there's been some talk at the FBI about rehabilitation and how that fits into the larger scheme of things. Do you get the sense that these individuals, once they've served their time in the United States, that there are avenues to rehabilitation and integration, or is it something that you feel the United States still has as a challenge ahead?
Well, we've recently looked at the recidivism of federal inmates. And I have to make the distinction there because the federal inmate population is minuscule compared to a state or local prison. And shockingly, or maybe not so shockingly, the recidivism of the federal inmates who were incarcerated for terrorism offenses is much less than the general recidivism for regular crime, or for crime in general, I should say. So that tells me that there may be a way that someone can be rehabilitated, someone can reintegrate into society. Now, I will caveat that by saying the people who have been incarcerated and are getting out now, with exceptions of those who have been released because of the DiMaia issue, have all been older. And the concern now is what's going to happen when the younger population who is in the federal system starts coming out. They will be younger, they will be more active. So I would certainly hope, because we all know that law enforcement is not necessarily the answer to this problem, I would certainly hope that reintegration is possible with this. And that's what's being shown at this point, but again, there's a lot of caveats to that. It's not quite as simple as saying, yes, they can go back into society.
Magnus, how is this playing out in Europe? And I like the distinction you drew before between the range of countries from Norway to France, which is a large spectrum. How is this issue of reintegration, getting out of prison? I mean, it's in the headlines all the time these days. Yeah. What's your take on it?
Well, it differs in different countries. We talked about the evidence base yesterday. There's a lot of evidence base in terms of security services having done analysis of the FTFs going. Maybe the gold standard is the German one, who looked at the different issues. I think they had 780 FTFs, about 300 came back. The interesting takeaway I got from that, even before they went into prison or being prosecuted, was the fact that only 25% of the individuals or the families cooperated with authorities. So we have to develop methods of how do we get to these people. The other issue was about half of them who came back, even before, if they were, forget about the prosecution, returned to old groups. And therefore, sometimes we talk about these individuals like they were vacuum packed, but they belong to what I would say a jihadi ecosystem, where you have hierarchies, where they plug in. So one of the issues is, of course, if they do come out of prison, what has the prison authority, what is the probation release authority, what are they doing in relation to sort of making them adjust? And that has to involve doing a risk assessment on the family, the risk assessment on the risks, but also of the protective factors. Often it's difficult in very small places. You have to really remove them almost from and they have to start afresh. And we don't have many of those cases where it has succeeded. But you have to have mentorship programs in place. That has to start even before. Many of these people have also criminal records, so they know the prison system and so on. But it will have to be done throughout the whole system. If you remember the Danish terrorist Omar Hussein, one of the problems was that he radicalized very quickly, but once he was released for a period of time, no one from the state had contact with him. and therefore he was able to very quickly put his plan in motion. So you have to have that holistic thinking about this issue. And I speak to a lot of law enforcement intelligence services across Europe. There's one thing they say to me, and that is, we cannot arrest our way out of this problem. We have to have both, put pressure on these ecosystems. Individuals will have to go into prison, but also we have to have prevention.
Yeah. Joshua, there's a lot of talk in the United States now about just the fact that we sort of dropped the ball on rehabilitation, right, and integration. And to Ian's point, this is not just about terrorism. It fits within the larger criminal justice system in the United States as well. How do you see? I mean, now that I'm sure you get these calls like I do, which is, what are we going to, how should we think about this? How should we think about this? And I want you to address Paul's point about also about youth versus the older folks. That I really do think there's a generational shift that causes different kinds of problems. And so just address this if you can.
Yeah, and maybe I'll start with the semantics of it, because I think we've probably all used the word reintegration. I know, and you have a tendency to use the word reintegration. Reintegration would be hard enough. It's actually just integration, right? What the population we're talking about here, those who are either attempting to become foreign terrorist fighters or who have become that and are now returning, generally the biggest commonality among them is that they're not integrated, in a sense, in the first place. That is ISIS's ability to find those who are vulnerable and who don't seem to feel fulfilled by their communities and the world around them. Those are the people most susceptible to being drawn into some other sense of purpose or belonging that a group like Al-Qaeda or ISIS purports to provide. And so it's really an integration challenge in the first place, because these folks tend not to ever have been integrated. So that makes it even harder. And it's important to situate this, as you have, Karen, in the context of a criminal justice system that, at least in the United States, doesn't do rehabilitation very well in any area, not just terrorism offenses, but in any area. So all of this adds to the challenge. And I think the answer, which you're hearing from all of us, is it's got to be more than the state. It's got to be about a state that, first of all, is trusted enough by communities, that communities want to play a part in this. And we could get into whether the current direction of the administration of the United States is helping or hurting community trust, but ultimately you need communities that are willing to play a role in integrating those who have initially somehow felt so detached that they've gone down this road, and who have then gone through the very traumatic experience of being in detention. That's hard, and I think it's even harder for the youth population that ISIS quite deliberately tried to target with slick internet productions and social media and videos, because they were, in a sense, pried away from those communities purposefully, and before the sort of bonds were created that might be at least the foundations to easily put them on a different path.
Yeah. Paul, one of the things that we're supposed to talk about on this panel is the way I read it, is backlash. If we overreach in our policies, if we overreach with the law, if we make a mistake with the law one way or another, who knows what the impact's going to be on, say, for example, a community that we then expect to interact with the government. How do you see this as a problem? Do you see this as a problem? Do you think that there are things that we could do to make it so that this kind of societal retrenchment doesn't happen, so that we marginalize a population or populations further, or alienate them further than what led them down this path to begin with?
Well, it's a good question. I think just in general, law enforcement in the United States has been making an effort based on a number of things. You had Ferguson, you had different issues like that. I know where I was in Salt Lake, we were reaching out to the refugee community to try and set up programs with the state police where the kids and the community could come out and play a football match or do something like that, where the police were not necessarily seen in their uniforms with their weapons shown, try and get people a little more comfortable with that. In Minneapolis, where there was a large Somali community, they did the same type of thing where they would go out to the community and talk to them. I think there is certainly room for improvement in that environment. It is a hard problem. I mean, we have this issue with different walks of life in the United States, and all I can tell you is that at the FBI, and I know with many of the state and local police forces, they are trying to get out to these underappreciated, these communities to try and build that trust. But it's going to be a long process. It's not a quick fix.
Magnus, how does that play out in the European context? Which countries have done the best to address what Paul was talking about, which is to actually have a dialogue, actually begin to build a basis for trust and communication?
I mean, I think there is, this issue of trust is absolutely essential. I mean, when you go out to these segregated areas, this is actually what is missing. They never call the police. The police is often maybe the only agency that's out there also. So it's a really difficult environment, and therefore, how do you create prevention in an environment of mistrust? I have to say, from the European perspective, it's doubly difficult because the legacy of 9/11, the legacy of Guantanamo, the legacy of this sort of have played out that there is a war on terrorism. Some of those who want to disrupt prevention, and there are groups, particularly in the UK, who are trying their hardest to make it as difficult as possible to have a narrative that you are spying on communities and so forth. And I think UK authorities have very cleverly, worked on terms of safeguarding. Safeguarding has become sort of the key term of safeguarding individuals, just like you would safeguard them from drugs. In terms of having a dialogue with different communities, different countries have different methods. I think it's a little bit maybe easier in the southern European countries. There is a little bit more live and let live attitude. I'm thinking here maybe of Spain and of Portugal. Of course, there are also sharp issues that come into play in terms of the intention behind trying to radicalize. And we heard yesterday that often prevention is done perhaps best indirectly, that you do not use the term we are discussing with you because of radicalization or violent extremism. We're discussing with you because you are part of our society. But I just want to say one thing that is in my country, Sweden, in Germany, and building on what we heard from the Greek minister, one of the big issues we don't talk about, it's not just the foreign terrorist fighters, it's not just the homegrown violent extremists. For those countries who took in refugees, they are now being processed, so we have failed asylum seekers. In other words, they have been given their due process, and we will have to find some mechanism of expelling them. And this may be an issue just for Germany and for Sweden, because we were the most generous in terms of taking in the individuals. Let me say, in Germany, 7 out of 8 of the last sort of terrorist plots and attacks were by failed asylum seekers. The one in Stockholm, we had a terrorist attack in the middle of the city. The person was not from the Middle East, he was from Central Asia. He was from Uzbekistan. He was one of 12,500 being sought by the police. That number in just my country, Sweden, will rise to, according to officials, 80,000. And we don't have the capacity, that's the physical capacity to be able to expel people, particularly also on human rights concerns of expelling them back to environments where they may face persecution. So it's a logistical, really difficult issue. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that, yes, foreign terrorist fighters are very, very dangerous. We have to keep an eye on them a long time. They plug into an ecosystem which we have to tackle. But it's not the only thing. It's also the others who are in their surroundings that may pose a really significant threat. And lastly, let me just say, I mean, I often make this to Swedish officials, like, how dangerous are Swedish terrorist foreign fighters? Well, there are 2 Swedes out of 300 who participated in the Paris and Brussels attack. They were returning foreign fighters, but they did not return to Sweden. They returned to Belgium. Right. And you have this transnational dimension, which you are blessed in the UK. You're outside of Schengen, and you may be permanently outside of Schengen.
But we still have a land border with the European Union, of course.
That's
and
right.
A very, very porous one as well.
But you will be able to detect them, and there are ways and means to detect them.
So I just want to go ahead. Say what you're going to say.
So I was going to just jump in there in relation to the United Kingdom's counterterrorism strategy, which is called Contest, which I think is a world-leading strategy. And I would say that because I used to run it in southwest England when I worked in the Home Office. But the emphasis of that strategy is a number of strands, and I never remember all of them, but prevent, prepare, pursue, and the one I always forget, protect. Thank you. But the emphasis on that is a structural response, security response, to beef up, largely speaking, to beef up our protection. I've argued very strongly, and Magnus is quite right about prevent in particular being subverted by ideologically inspired critics of the system, because prevent actually works extremely well. And prevent is now taking on more and more, incidentally, more and more cases of people who are brought to the attention of the authorities for screening in terms of far-right extremism, which we've seen become intellectualized in the United Kingdom and become much more of a serious threat than it ever was heretofore. But what we need to do is have an additional strand to our strategy, I think, which speaks to what my colleagues have been talking about. And it's something that I would call promote. And it's about connecting to communities, often segregated communities, that are alienated from the state. And we have them, we have pockets of them across the United Kingdom. And some of those pockets are producing homegrown terrorists who want to kill us. So we need to have a conversation with those communities who have become isolated about what common values that we share. And I know that sounds very sort of highfalutin, as it were, but this hasn't been properly attempted before. What normally happens is the state conducts that conversation with self-styled community representatives. Often those people aren't working, frankly, in the interests of the communities that they serve and have their own political agendas. So we need to have a conversation, and we need to go round those people, if necessary, that I've just described, to talk about what common values we have. Because one thing is for sure, and we've said it, Josh, you said it, and Magnus, you said it as well, that the state alone cannot defeat this national security threat. We've got to bring in communities, particularly these isolated communities, and start having a conversation with them. Otherwise, the conversation will continue in brutal terms, frankly, between the terrorists and the rest of us.
I want to push on this, something Magnus brought up at the very beginning, which is the connection, whether it's interpersonal, interideological, or separate. The connection, or just policy, in terms of sort of right-wing extremism and Islamic, fundamentalist extremism, and you've sort of danced around the overlay of this. I remember that in Norway, which has I think, one of the more interesting counterterrorism programs, based it on their program that they'd had decades before that for what we would call right-wing terrorism. And so to them, it was one policy adapted for another policy, and they weren't making distinctions based on the particular group. They were seeing this in a larger context. So I'm wondering how all of you, what are and Peter Bergen brought this up yesterday in the United States. Let's focus on our issue right now is sort of domestic terrorism, and we need to look at that. So, and some of you referred to homegrown terrorism, which could be a variety of different ideological strands. So is there and I want to start with Magnus because you first brought it up, is there an overlap between right-wing extremism and Islamist extremism? Are they separate groups? And when you talk about the prisons and separating them, where does that fit into this larger pool? Do you separate one from the other, or do you just separate? You get what I'm saying, right? Do you just so Magnus Easter? Yeah. Then we'll get to the American.
Well, I think in general, of course, when you speak to security services and others, the main focus is on the jihadist issue. But the scale and scope of that challenge is massive in relation to the information that's coming in. This is in the public domain, the Swedish Security Service, which is a relatively small service in Europe. They get 6,000 pieces of information on terrorism every month that they will have to go through and investigate. That may not sound much from the US perspective, but for a service we also have to deal with multiple languages, Central Asian languages and others. It's a huge challenge, and they are running faster and faster, and they are trying to stay ahead of this issue. While they are looking at the jihadist issue, of course, right-wing extremism is becoming very polarizing. So there is this reciprocal polarization, reciprocal radicalization. They are thriving off each other. I mentioned the failed asylum seekers. We should not stigmatize the asylum community when you have a large section who go then underground and who are not expelled from the country for practical reasons, it fuels left-wing extremism who wants to protect them and right-wing extremism. We're also seeing increasingly the issue of what I would call that there's a spectrum between right-wing populist parties, alt-right, and neo-Nazis. And there's an international dimension to that as well. We have in Sweden a country to the east of us, which is a large country. And of course, we have had Swedish neo-Nazi, the Swedish resistance movement, who have actually trained in St. Petersburg with a unit called the Partisan unit, paramilitary training. And it was brought up yesterday also about the Ukraine and the Azov brigade and that dimension. So you have all of these different things happening at the same time. You have to also, as a state, not just focus in on a community. You have to treat all the different forms of extremism equally. And this, you have to do that in a space where you have those who want to undermine the prevention program. This is not a neutral space. This civil society is not a neutral space. There are those who want to actively become activists and go against the state and to mobilize the forces, mainly seen in the UK, but it's also happening in other countries. It's really dangerous to speak about Muslims as a collective. There are different orientations, different directions. The more we start to educate the public that the Muslim community is not one, it's many, the better. But I think, definitely we have a problem, and I'm worried about the right-wing populist dimensions that is developing and unfolding in the mix of things, because that also makes the work really difficult to talk about within the sort of public sense. The public is also an interesting dimension in this, because often you say, okay, well, they come back from Syria, FDFs, let's put them in prison. Unfortunately, in some countries, there's no heavy prison sentence. You mentioned 18 years, right? Yeah. If you get to put away for murder, yes. But in most cases, in our country, if you come back and if you've been participating, if we get through our legislation, you get probably 2 years, maybe three quarters of that. In some countries, it's 6 to 10 years. So UK is experiencing this, because after 2005, you had hundreds of people that were prosecuted on lesser charges. And they're now going to come out, and you have a program in place, but in many other countries, you don't have a program in place in terms of how do you reintegrate them, how do you rehabilitate them, what is your holistic thinking?
So anybody else want to weigh in on this? Joshua?
Well, it's a little bit different from overlap, but I do think there's an interplay between radicalization in the physical world and radicalization online that has some similarities between what we're seeing in the United States about essentially right-wing extremism, and what groups like ISIS have done. The chronology is different. When I think about ISIS, I think, well, they really got traction in the virtual world once they built something in the physical world. They start tweeting out these images of them crossing that border from Syria into Iraq, and something grows from that. And then there's a cycle in which the conversation happening online yields real foreign fighters showing up on the battlefield, and that cycle continues. In the United States, the far right, the neo-Nazi kind of brand of extremism had been largely gathering some steam online first. They were having these conversations, they were appropriating memes, they were having their own dialogue, and then they burst into the physical world with Charlottesville in August of last year. And it has a somewhat similar effect of it gives them something to talk about. It creates a cycle in which they retreat after this weekend, and there's a lot to then talk about as a virtual community. Say, people really showed up, you really came, we built something there for a day, we challenged authority. And so that interplay and the complexity of it, and I know the next panel is going to get into it a bit, even if the chronology is different, the idea that there's something that a community takes away from those experiences that creates a momentum, and a momentum that's challenging for law enforcement to break into, there are some similarities there.
Ian, have you thought about this in terms of how this affects the prison community and how your whole concept of separation versus,
Sure. I was tasked to specifically look into Islamist extremism in prisons, but of course, in doing so, we looked at any reactive forces that might have been created by that. And what we saw, certainly a couple of years ago, was there was a nascent far-right grouping. It was often to do with, inside our high-security estates, struggles for power and space, where some of our prisons are now becoming quite segregated between Muslim gangs and far-right gangs, and then the people that are stuck in the middle. So I think the capability within prisons is certainly there for far-right extremism to flourish, particularly in what they would perceive to be a reaction against a threat to them inside the prison system. In that respect, we're probably catching up with the United States in terms of the analogous gang problems that you have. One of the things that I was clear about in terms of recommending separation units being created was that the concept was for highly subversive individuals to be separated from the audience. So in that respect, people who are proselytizing a far-right ideology, hateful ideology, could also be separated. And the purpose of separation, we need to be very clear about, it is that what we discovered was that there was a very clear psychological bond between the preacher, and that could be a preacher of Islamist ideology or far-right ideology, and his adherents, because it's largely a male threat inside our prisons. And breaking that link creates a kind of cognitive break that offers opportunities to do something different on both sides of the equation, and to disrupt that very destructive relationship that is forming. So I think we will face growing problems from the far right inside prisons, particularly in reaction to things that happen outside, and in relation to power, struggles for power and space and meaning inside prisons. And we must be alert to that. But again, it often comes back to a more societal response as well as a security response in being able to have conversations with communities. In terms of far-right communities, the perception that these people are not spoken to or about and have been taken for granted. And the Brexit issue has, I'm sorry to bring up Brexit again, but it has toxified this debate in terms of perceptions of mass migration, how communities have changed, and that's become a ripe recruiting ground for far-right ideologies. So we've got to, as well as having a robust security response, have a societal response which relies on the state working in partnership with communities, both in terms of people who are in prison. As Magnus has said, we've got a bulge of people now who are coming out of the criminal justice system. Some of those people will have long periods of community supervision, which, as I've said before, is only done by the state in the United Kingdom, unlike many countries in Western Europe which have solicited help from NGOs, for example. I think we need to move into that model. Otherwise, we've got alienated people who will not have been helped by their current experience in British prisons, returning into communities with many of the same characteristics as sex offenders returning into a community. If you want me to just explain that for a second. So you've got terrorist offenders who are suffering from shame, alienation, who will be rigorously controlled by license conditions, quite necessary conditions in terms of where they live and who they talk to and what access they have to the internet and so on. It'll be very difficult for them to find a place to live. It'll be almost impossible for them to find a job and to re-establish family relationships. So in that toxic mix, I think you have all the conditions for continued radicalized behavior, and the risk then that those people will return to terrorism because they've got no other opportunities open to them, and because society has so fundamentally rejected them. So again, I would push for a partnership. A partnership is what will protect our security and safety best of all.
Paul, one of the questions that comes up, and I'm going to start weaving the questions into what we're doing, follows directly on that, which has to do with partnerships. And the question is the FBI the best placed actor to work on pre-radicalization? And before you answer, if you have questions at foreignfightersandreturnees.com. And then he goes on to say, shouldn't it rather be other partners than the FBI to work in the stage of pre-radicalization, or at least FBI should be the backbenchers? And I wanted you to answer that, not just for pre-radicalization, but for the after-prison moment. And just how do you see the FBI's willingness to step back? Do you think that that should be the model, or should it be different for pre-radicalization as opposed to integration? I'm using Joshua's term, the integration. I'm buying that. Go ahead.
No, I would agree. The FBI is, DT is, domestic terrorism is a perfect example in the United States. Without a specific call to action, you have to have that grain of someone going to do something. The FBI is really not even allowed to get involved in the pre-conversation of that because of the freedom of speech. So the FBI certainly is a partner in this, but we shouldn't be in the forefront of this. Now, in the cases that I explained, especially the one in Utah, we were partners with the state police, but that was more just to put a face with a name and not necessarily be in the pre-radicalization piece. And again, I would say it's the same with someone leaving prison. The FBI's role is not to monitor someone leaving prison. We certainly need to know who the terrorists are, where they're going, but that's not really our role. That would be the role of probation and parole or some other action.
Well, let me just follow up with this. Over the course of the however many decades you want to take this, there have been a number of NGOs out there who, and also local community service organizations who have tried to be in this space and have tried to get to know law enforcement. Do you feel that that's a community interchange that's grown over time, or is it very much that law enforcement stays in its own lane?
I would say that within the past 4 or 5 years, I think that dialogue between NGOs and law enforcement has gotten much stronger. I think probably prior to that, it was really one lane versus another, where they didn't necessarily intertwine. But I know that, for example, our field offices routinely bring community people in to discuss the problems within the community, whether that's gang related or terrorism related or whatever. So I see that the FBI, in which is what I can talk about, has gotten much better at discussing matters that affect the different communities within an area.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think, and from the other point of view, from the NGOs, there's been much more comfort with talking to law enforcement generally, and so it's sort of been a give and take. We have a question about rule of law and good governance, so I'm going to go to you on this, because it starts like this, which is a little combative, so I definitely won't say the writer. We read countless think tank and academic reports that conclude with policy recommendations about advocating the need to increase rule of law and promote good governance. Has any of this happened? Have the think tanks, just to follow up from the NGO, have the think tanks produced anything that has actually affected policy? And I think the answer is yes, but can you tell us how?
I think the answer is yes as well. You know, going back to my own time in government, I should say at a general level, I think those sorts of reports are really important. I made an effort with colleagues to get out of what can be a bubble. When you work in government, especially in policymaking, and especially in counterterrorism, which is a very defined community at this point, you can find yourself in meetings and on the phone all day with essentially the same incredibly dedicated, incredibly talented, but the same people. And to force yourself to read something that somebody incredibly dedicated and talented, but outside of that bubble has produced, to have them come brief you on it, or a colleague and I used to try to actually go to them, something about leaving the White House and going to a think tank and sitting in a different space, I found it refreshing. That's obviously a very general answer. I do think at a more specific level, there has been a much needed push to bring counterterrorism within the rule of law. I mean, if you go back far enough to some of the post 9/11 reactions, there was very much a need to be pushed to bring those within the rule of law, given how detainees were being handled, given how intelligence collection was being handled. Did all of it come out of one think tank report? Of course not. Part of it came out of important investigative journalism. Part of it came out of the government itself checking itself. But part of it came from oversight, at least at some point in the process, by the legislative branch of the executive branch. But does all of that push to take counterterrorism and ensure that it comports with international legal obligations as well as domestic law, does that push people in government to grapple with where there still may be shortcomings and gaps? I think the answer is yes.
I mean, one leader in this, I think, has been, what we saw yesterday, is CTED at the UN, has really made it their mission to, so just a little plug, but seriously.
And also, just because you brought up the kind of international component, the conversation among at least some set of countries about counterterrorism and the rule of law internationally, I think, has been a productive one. Because even today, which seems in some senses like a while since 9/11, though in a historical sense it's not that long, but even now there are differing views of how things like the law of armed conflict applies to counterterrorism. And that's a difference even at times between very close allies. That you don't need to see that eye to eye to partner and work together, but to have a dialogue that's been ongoing for years now among top lawyers at the United States, the UK, France, a number of countries on these issues, and to have to answer sometimes very tough questions from partners about why should we share that intelligence or let you use that base if we don't see your approach to the law the same way. I think that's healthy.
And it goes on to this day. Ian, there's a question for you. And you're gonna have to do a little backup, but this was a big story in the United States in recent weeks. What are the implications of Ajam Chowdhury's release from prison? And I think we had to guess that was gonna come up, so if you could just help the audience with, I mean, you can imagine how this played in the United States, so can you just...
Of course, yeah. A brief background on Ajam Chowdhury. He's an Islamic State ideologue who was imprisoned for 5 years for encouraging terrorism in the United Kingdom and has recently been released, and people have been very baffled about how he's been released halfway through his sentence. In fact, Chowdhury was sentenced to the full extent of the law on the basis of the evidence that was available at the time, and our system gives credit for time spent, in his case, in house arrest prior to his trial. So his release is not, in one sense, exceptional. What has caused lots of controversy is why he hasn't been put in prison indefinitely, because he seems to be a completely unrepentant proselytizer for Islamic State who shows all the signs of wanting to go back to that work whenever his supervision in the community is finished. My personal view is that Chowdhury is a narcissist and an attention seeker. And the more that we can do to make Ajam Chowdhury and people like him disappear from public consciousness, the better. I have an anxiety about how he's being managed, because there's obviously lots of public anxiety, as you would expect, about somebody as dangerous as Chowdhury. During the trial, it was revealed that there was intelligence to suggest he had mobilised 100 UK nationals to go and fight in Syria. This is a very persuasive and very dangerous man. However, we want to avoid trying to turn him into a bogeyman. We want him to we need to rather avoid giving him the notoriety that he craves. And my anxiety is that in response to public anxiety, he has, I think, 25 licence conditions for his supervision in the community. Now, knowing Chowdhury's case and Chowdhury's psychology to some extent, I have absolutely no doubt at all that he will manipulate those conditions. I mean, we've talked about lots of judicial activism in terms of legislation against terrorism. We also have a very healthy protections through the Human Rights Act, which entrenches the Convention on Human Rights in law. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if Chowdhury and Chowdhury's legal team, for example, in relation to all these quite punitive conditions on him, didn't mount a challenge either under human rights legislation to say that, for example, they were disproportionate, or they were interfering with his family life or privacy, or have some of the licence conditions judicially reviewed. The purpose of that will be to gain extra publicity, I've no doubt at all, and to be able to perhaps even either by accident or by design martyr him and to put him back into prison. Now, there was some discussion about whether or not Anjem Chowdhury was in a separation centre, the centres that I recommended government created while he was in custody. And I think if he was, and I'm quite pleased we don't know for sure, because that was one of the stipulations I suggested, that there was very little information about who went in there and what happened, for obvious reasons. But he clearly qualifies as somebody who ought to have been separated from any adherence. I think it's really difficult for the state to manage this balance, frankly, between protecting society from Chowdhury when he's on supervision and going overboard and almost doing a Capone on him. So he will definitely trip up and be put back into prison. So it's a really difficult challenge. I think Chowdhury's of this world, he's a narcissist, he's very notorious, and he wants attention. We need to separate people like him from other very dangerous people who are below the waterline, who are coming out of custody, who will really need long-term protection from engaging in terrorism.
I just want to weigh in terms of, he's not just a UK problem, and I'm sure many European countries were very happy that there is travel bans, there are restrictions, because he was absolutely instrumental in creating Sharia for Belgium, Sharia for Holland, the call to Islam in Denmark, Prophet's Ummah in Norway, these feeder groups, and there are leaders within these groups that are absolutely key in the facilitation. The dilemma is, of course, on human rights grounds, whether he will challenge that and how he will try to circumvent that by, for example, people around him that will probably maybe communicate to the outside world. But it's absolutely essential we tackle some of these key feeder groups and so on into this, because it is organized.
So one of the questions follows up on this, which is, what's happening with Sheikh Amr, the Gitmo detainee that's in the UK? Any response on that?
I don't know enough about it.
Oh, okay. We will come back to that at another time. I'm going to read you this question. It's for all of you. On the one hand, we are talking about violent extremism, often religious in nature, that has essentially been rejected by society and is not an existential threat. On the other hand, right-wing extremism, often instrumentalizing fear of foreign fighters, has arguably been mainstreamed. How do we cope with this issue, given that it's become so mainstream? So you might want to push back on that it's become mainstream. Or not.
I mean, I see what the question's getting at, which is there's been in political dialogue, I think in the United States, I think in parts of Europe and probably elsewhere, I think a mainstreaming, at least something of a normalizing of ways to talk about communities, about immigrants, about vulnerable populations that I think was largely seen as out of bounds not that many years ago. And to the extent that the question is getting at that, I do see it as a real challenge, because obviously, you know, people are entitled to a range of political views, but when you have a demonizing of populations and overstating of hyping of threats, you get some very reactive policies. You also get people who are reactive in their own hands. And I worry that recent events in the United States have shown, even where there's individual culpability for the sort of horrific acts that have happened over the past couple of weeks, from the pipe bomb to Pittsburgh synagogue, you also have context for those. And people get ideas in part because of what they hear in political dialogue. And we see that as we dig into kind of the backstories of these sorts of people. You know, one would hope that there'd be a willingness to keep political dialogue, whatever one's policy views, in a space where it doesn't seem to encourage or even implicitly endorse real demonization, but that does not seem to be the direction in which things are going. I guess some of us hope that parties, or at least I'll speak for myself, I hope that the political parties ultimately see more to lose from this than to gain. That at some point it's really it's a responsibility to kind of get back political discourse into productive, if still at times fraught, bounds. But I'm not sure I see that trend happening yet.
I have a question for all of you that stems from this, which is, what works? What's worked? And you can speak just for the United States, or you can speak more broadly, whatever you'd like.
What works in which context?
What do you think that's really been an effective, of all of the counterterrorism strategies, what has been the most effective? And at what stage? The pre-radicalization stage? What's deterred?
Well,
what successfully deters?
From the law enforcement perspective, the thing that the U.S. sees that has worked the best has been getting to someone, and this kind of goes across the criminal spectrum, but if you can get to someone before they actually get to committing that act, that tends to be the better course of action. Now, once someone's gone down the path towards a traveler or towards attack planning or something like that, what works the best in the law enforcement sense is the information sharing. You know, we have many cases where the UK will end up benefiting from information that we have, or we will benefit from information from any of the countries that we work with. And that's where we can kind of try and get our hands around this issue. But again, if you can get to someone before they go down the road towards committing an act or towards that attack, that's always the better course.
So prevention.
Prevention is,
the prevention strategy. Joshua?
I agree with that, but to add something else, I think you need to deny terrorists safe haven. And even as we talk about a world in which they can communicate virtually and recruit online, there is still something about having physical space that remains dangerous. And we saw this with Al-Qaeda, we saw this with Shabab, we saw this with ISIS. And it's very hard once that safe haven has been acquired to roll it back. I mean, this has been a multi-year campaign to squeeze ISIS into now 1% of the territory it held in Iraq and Syria. It was a multi-month campaign just to squeeze ISIS out of Sirte, Libya, a single city there. But at some point, people are drawn, it seems, to this idea of finding some sense of belonging in a real community that controls territory and is purporting to build something. And as costly as it can be to deny groups that, it seems like it's ultimately more costly to allow that to fester.
Magnus.
Depends on what, if you're on the macro level, or I'm just going to do it within Europe. I would be remiss, I'd probably be fired also from the EU Radicalization Awareness Network.
You can't be fired.
I can't be fired.
You're
I'm part of it. I'm part of it. You know, in Europe, prevention is the main challenge. We have since 2011. We have a network of 4,000 practitioners working every single day. Ian is part of that as well. Exchanging practice of methods, of what works, what doesn't work, and we are intensifying that. We are bridging policymakers, practitioners, academics, so we have evidence base. And so that is working. We have a template as well of how we should do that, how we should do it individually within a country. There is an integration issue. Integration issue is that we have a lot of expertise on the national level. How do we bend stovepipes between the different agencies? How do we push that down to the local level? And therefore, I mean, the most important work we can do is having national CVE coordinators who actually act as a motor to get cities to work, to develop an action plan. And there is a template for action plans. I headed up the Copenhagen anti-radicalization plan. Great for a Swede in Denmark to do that. That was a joke, actually, but but you know, there's a template. You know, you need hotlines, helplines. You can have mentors. You can have psychologists, mental health specialists. You can have family support. You have rehabilitation. I would urge you to go to. It's often called the Aarhus model, to the chagrin of all the other cities. But the Danish CVE Center, it's called Stop Extremism. They have a handbook of how to do mentorship, of using life psychology, of actually organizing this thing. So I've been pushing our network and others to get, look, we need to do this at a city level, and we need to shift the neighborhoods. Because most of these problems, in my own country, we had 304 foreign fighters. They come from 4 cities. If we get that right, then you know, we can move this space.
Ian, we're out of time, but I want to hear your magic wand. What works?
I'll do it quick. All of the above plus 2 things. One is normality. Let's not forget, terrorists hate normality. Let's normalize a criminal justice system response to terrorism and not give them the oxygen that they rely on in order to make us all fearful. The second thing, and I say this as a Remainer, leaving the European Union, is partnership. As far as this is concerned, this challenge, we are a global village. We must maintain partnership across the globe. And we've got lots of people representing countries across the globe here to learn from each other and to work to defeat this scourge.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, and you were wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.